Probable sampling technique 1. Dear students, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. R. Sharatha, Professor in the Department of Chemistry, Avanashalingam Institute for Home Science and Higher Education for Women, Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu. Today's discussion is on the probable sampling technique 1, which extends to the highlights, advantage, disadvantage, simple random sampling and systematic sampling. As narrated in the previous chapter, the purpose of effective sampling is to do research with a small representative group by applying manageable control mechanisms to get objective results to a large extent, which can be applied to the population for the purpose of generalization and further work. The probable sample technique or a simple random sampling technique addresses this specific purpose in research. Population is generally denoted by capital N and the sample is represented by small n, and the percentage of sample with respect to the population depends on the type of analysis the researcher intends to do and also on the basis of the variables. We shall first discuss simple random sampling, which is one of the most extensively used methods of sampling. Simple random sampling is a procedure where the researcher selects the required number of subjects for the study from a population in such a way that every subject in the population has an equal chance of getting included for the study. Let us take an example where the researcher wants to select 40 home science students to know their views about the food items that are rich in protein. The list of students of the university specializing in a home science course may be the population, say 298, from where the researcher wants to select the required number. There are different methods to select this number. In lottery method, the researcher may write the names of all the 298 students of the university in pieces of papers, but put them in a box and ask a neutral person to pick 40 students. This is called a lot system and more systematic in nature, as everyone in the university has an equal chance of getting selected. One may argue that this procedure involves cost and requires more human resources, and therefore researchers usually apply this technique when the population is small. In table of random numbers method, the researcher may obtain the list of students of the university specializing in home science and select 298 students using the table of random numbers. List of random numbers does not follow a pattern, and as indicated in the name, the numbers are simply random in nature. The first 40 random numbers may be used to get the required sample from the list of the students of the university. This method is generally used by the researchers as it is easy to administer and does not involve cost and more resources. However, some researchers may try to adopt other methods of simple random sampling. In selecting from a sequential list method, the names are first arranged in alphabetical order or any simple serial order, and from that every 10th or any other sequential name will be selected. The method of grid system is generally used to select an area on the map where the research should be undertaken. In this, map of an entire area is prepared and a screen with squares is placed on the map so as to select the areas that fall under the squares as the samples. Now, as we understand what a simple random sample is, let's consider how to select a random sample.
which involves few important steps to be followed. The first one is deciding the population. If a researcher is determined to study 1500 university students, we can say that the entire 1500 students can become our sampling frame. If the researcher is interested only in those who have opted for home science as their course, all other students could be excluded from creating our sampling frame, which would be much less than 1500 students. Hence, deciding the population is the first important step. Next is choosing the sample size. Let's assume that we select a sample size of 200 students. The sample is expressed as small n. This number is chosen as it reflects the limit of our budget and the time we have to distribute our questionnaire to the students. However, we could have also determined the sample size we needed using a sample size calculation, which is a particularly useful statistical tool. Choosing the right sample size, which is highly essential for desired results, is very important as it can reflect on the entire research. The third is listing the population. In order to select a sample of 200 students, we need to identify all 1500 students at the university. For actually carrying out this research, the researcher will have to view a list of all students studying at the university. Next is assigning numbers to each unit. The researcher has to assign a consecutive number from 1 to capital N next to each of the students. In our case, this would mean assigning a consecutive number from 1 to 1500, that is capital N, which is 1500, the population of the students at the university. The fifth step is finding random numbers. After assigning numbers, the next step is to prepare a list of random numbers from the total list of 1500 students. These random numbers can be found using any of the methods mentioned so far. The last step is by selecting the sample. Finally, we select the sample from the entire population of 1500 students who will be invited to take part in the research. In this case, this would mean selecting 200 random numbers from the random number table. Imagine the first three numbers from the random number table were 0011, that is the 11th student from the numbered list of 1500, 1331, the 1331st student from the list, 981, the 981st student from the list. We would select the 11th, 1331st and 981st students from our list to be part of the sample. We keep doing this until we have all 200 students that we want in our sample. To answer the question, how does this method of sampling benefit the researchers? We have to discuss the advantages of the method. Simple random sampling is certainly an ideal sampling technique. Simple random technique largely reduces the non-sampling errors provided the procedures are applied well in collecting data. For large surveys involving huge population, simple random technique is effective. This method is used extensively in researches. Ease of use represents the biggest advantage of simple random sampling. Unlike more complicated sampling methods such as stratified random sampling and probability sampling, no need exists to divide the population into subpopulations or take any other additional steps before selecting members of the population at random. A simple random is meant to be an unbiased representation of a group. It is considered a fair way to select a sample from a large population, since every member of the population has an equal chance of getting selected. It is said that every coin has two sides. Similarly, simple random sampling method also has a few disadvantages. They are: collection of data using this procedure takes time. Sometimes effective control over the variables used in the study also becomes an issue. A sampling error can occur with a simple random sample if the sample does not end up accurately reflecting the population it is supposed to represent. For example, in our simple random sample of 25 employees, it would be possible to draw 25 men even if the population consisted of 125 women and 125 men. For this reason, simple random sampling is more commonly used when the researcher knows little about the population. If the researcher knew more, it would be better to use a different sampling technique such as stratified random sampling, which helps to account for the differences within the population such as age, race or gender. Now let's take a look at how simple random sampling is applied in researches. Besides surveys, simple random sampling technique is used in longitudinal studies and cross-sectional studies too. Sampling in a longitudinal study is conducted over a period of time to investigate the pattern of changes. Cohort, trend and panel studies are the different types of longitudinal study. In cohort studies, population remains the same, but the sample varies in every data collection point. In trend study, both the population and sample changes at every data collection point. In panel study, the same sample is studied over a period of time. Sampling in cross-sectional study, the researcher predetermines the sample when the sample is not predetermined, and when the researcher selects the entire population for the study, it is called census. Gallup pools adopt cross-sectional research study procedures. For example, in a medical study, the population might be all adults over age 50 who have diabetes. In another study, the population might be all hospitals in India that perform liver transplantation surgery. In these studies, selecting a simple random sample is much harder. A good way to select a simple random sample for the second example would proceed as follows. First, obtain or make a list of all hospitals in India that perform liver transplantation surgery. Number them 1, 2, etc. up to the total number of capital M of hospitals in the population. Such a list is called a sampling frame. Then use some sort of random number generating process to obtain a simple random sample of size small n from the population of integers 1, 2, etc. up to m. The simple random sample of hospitals would consist of the hospitals in the list that correspond to the numbers in the simple random samples of numbers. Now that we have discussed simple random sampling in detail, we further proceed to the systematic method of sampling. From the name systematic sampling, it is understood that it involves a system or procedure. Systematic sampling is a technique to create a random probability sample. In this, the researcher will select the units from the population at a fixed interval of inclusion into the sample. For example, if the researcher wants to select 200 students of a university out of the total enrolled students of 1500, the researcher would select the first item or unit in population from the table of random numbers and then select the further units at a specified interval. If the researcher is selecting the fourth unit, then he might tend to select the other units at an interval of 9 units. Thus, after the 4th, the 13th, 22nd, 31st, 40th, 49th, 58 and so on will be selected until the 200 sample size is obtained. In few situations, the most practical way of sampling is to select every ith item on a list, which is the strategy used in systematic sampling. A criterion of randomness is introduced into this method of sampling by using random numbers to pick up the unit with which to start. For instance, if a 4% sample is desired, the first item would be selected randomly from the first 25, and thereafter every 25th item would automatically be included in the sample. Thus, in systematic sampling, only the first unit is selected randomly and the remaining units in the sample are selected at fixed intervals. Although a systematic sample is not a random sample in the strict sense of the term, but it is often considered reasonable to treat systematic sample as if it were a random sample. The process of obtaining the systematic sample is much like an arithmetic progression. The first step is deciding the starting number. The researcher selects an integer that must be less than the total numbers of individuals in the population. This integer will correspond to the first step. Then, the next step is to decide the interval. After deciding the first item, the researcher selects another number which will serve as the constant difference between any two consecutive numbers. The integers is typically selected so that the researcher obtains the correct sample size. For example, the researcher has a population total of 1500 individuals and need 200 subjects. He first chooses the starting numbers 5. Then the researcher picks his interval 4. The members of this sample will be individuals 5, 9, 13, 37, 49, 61, 69, etc. Other researchers use a modified systematic random sampling technique wherein they first identify the needed sample size. Then they divide the total numbers of the population with the sample size to obtain the sampling fraction. The sampling fraction is then used as the constant difference between subjects. You can also use a different method from it by selecting a different element from each interval with a simple random sampling technique. By adopting this, systematic sampling can be classified under probability sampling designs. To select a random sample, you must have a sampling frame. Sometimes this is not possible, or obtaining one may be too expensive. However, in real life, there are situations where a kind of sampling frame exists. For example, records of enrollment list of students in a school or university, electoral lists of people living in a district or an area, or records of the staff employed in an organization. All these can be used as a sampling frame to select a sample with the systematic sampling technique. This convenience of having a ready-made sampling frame may be at a price. In some cases, it may not truly be a random listing. Mostly these lists are in alphabetical order based upon a number assigned to a case or arranged in a way that is convenient to the users of the records. If the width of an interval is large, say 1 to 30 cases, and if the cases are arranged in alphabetical order, you could preclude some whose surnames start with the same letter, or some adjoining letter may not be included at all. Let's assume there are 100 students in a class and you want to select 50 students using the systematic sampling technique. The first step is to determine the width of the interval, that is 100 divided by 50, which gives you 2. This means that from every 2 you have to select one element. Using the SRS technique, select one of the elements from the first interval 1 to 2 elements. Suppose you have selected the second element, from the rest of the intervals you would select every second element. Systematic sampling is one of the easiest and convenient methods of sampling. Its advantages are: the systematic sampling is very simple to use. It allows the researchers to add a degree of system or process into the random selection of subjects. The population will be evenly sampled. The samples will be evenly distributed over the population. This method is less costly and it can be used for large populations. Implementing and using systematic sampling is quite easier and it can be conveniently used in case of large populations. Systematic sampling can produce a research that is free from bias, as it eliminates the possibility of selecting elements that create bias. Indeed, there are few drawbacks with this method of sampling too. The process of selection can interact with a hidden periodic trait within the population. If the sampling technique coincides with the periodicity of the trait, the sampling technique will no longer be random and representativeness of the sample is compromised. When creating a systematic sample, the researcher must take care to ensure that the interval of selection does not create bias, selecting elements that share a trait. For instance, every 25th item produced by a certain production process is defective. If we are to select a 4% sample of the items of this process in a systematic manner, we would either get all defective items or all good items in our sample, depending upon the random starting position. If all elements of the universe are considered in a manner representative of the total population, that is, the population list is in random order, systematic sampling is considered equivalent to random sampling. But if this is not so, then the results of such sampling may at times not be very reliable. Besides the other disadvantages, there is one crucial risk that is associated with systematic sampling. Systematic sampling puts forth one inevitable risk to the researcher, namely, when conducting a systematic sampling, the researchers must take into consideration the manner in which the list used is being organized. If the subjects placed on the list are organized in a cyclic pattern that matches the sampling interval, the selected sample may be biased. For example, a university's administration wants to pick a sample of lecturers and ask how they feel about university's policies. Lecturers are grouped in teams of 20, with each team headed by a coordinator. If the list used to pick the sample size is organized with teams clustered together, the researcher risks picking only coordinators or no coordinators at all, depending on the sampling interval. Hence, proper care and considerations has to be given while using systematic sampling as the method of sampling in the study.
Let us summarize. In this chapter, we have thoroughly discussed the important features of simple random sampling and systematic sampling, their advantages and limitations as well. Simple random sampling is a procedure where the researcher selects the required number of subjects for the study from a population in such a way that every subject in the population has an equal chance of getting included in the study. This feature of providing equal chance for everyone to get selected for the study makes the simple random sampling preferable for most of the research studies. However, the chances of specific groups getting selected cannot be ruled out. even when the samples are selected randomly. Lot system, use of table of random numbers, etc. are most common methods of simple random sampling, and there is a general consensus that simple random sampling will largely reduce the bias in a research. In systematic sampling, the researcher selects the units from the population at a fixed interval for inclusion into the study. Though this is convenient from the point of view of resources, bias cannot be ruled out, as every person in the population does not get an equal chance to participate in the study. Again, the time and convenience factors should also be taken into consideration in these exercises. If a research simply wants to know about the trend of the population towards the particular variable or an entity, systematic sampling may be an easy procedure, but the limitation should also be understood in this process. Therefore, selection of sample is a factor of time and resources too, and these aspects have been enumerated in this chapter, and I hope you have understood the nuances of simple random and systematic sampling techniques through this lesson. I shall get back to you with another interesting chapter soon.